everyone, my name is Nella, and I'll be speaking on longer flock cycles, exploring a new path to sustainable egg production in Canada. Longer flock cycles is the management trend of keeping birds in production for longer, and a common goal by genetic companies is 500 eggs within 100 weeks. The purpose of my project was to explore what it takes to pursue this management strategy and curate case studies of producers that are successful. To do this, I did 24 interviews with people from North America, Latin America, Europe, and Australia, and it gave me a better appreciation for what flock cycle length is around the world. As you can see, many regions are taking their birds to 90, 100 weeks of age, but in Canada, we're a bit behind on the trend. It's important to talk about this trend in the context of sustainability because a lot of the benefits are related. A major motivating factor for producers are the economic benefits. However, in places like Europe, the environmental benefits are a major factor. It's interesting to note that many of the economic benefits contribute to those environmental benefits, and those environmental benefits then contribute to the industry's social license to operate. In exploring this topic, I realized that there are challenges that affect all producers, and there's also challenges that disproportionately affect Canadian producers. Now, unfortunately, I can't talk about all the challenges, but I am going to talk about the ones that came up most in conversation. And I'll start with those challenges that affected all producers, under the categories of animal welfare and health. Severe feather pecking was noted as a primary welfare concern by many interviewees, and that's because the nature of keeping birds for longer means that a producer has to manage an outbreak for longer if it occurs. Now, although this problem happens in all housing systems, there is an increased risk in non-cage systems, which complicates the trend of longer flock cycles. Challenges include extra management in order to avoid a loss of those social and economic benefits, which is why prevention is key. That looks like habituating the birds to stress, starting at the pullet stage, and the use of environmental enrichment. Another welfare issue is bone health. By keeping the birds longer, we're asking them to remodel their skeletal calcium reserves for longer as well. And right now, a major issue in the laying hen industry is keel bone damage, which unfortunately does increase with age and contributes to a loss of those benefits. Again, prevention is essential. That might look like training during the rearing phase, the use of ramps and platforms in aviary systems, and a huge emphasis on pullet nutrition to allow the birds to properly develop their skeletal calcium reserves so that they can produce for longer. I now want to move on to the challenge of vaccine coverage. A Flemish researcher I talked to said it's definitely a concern because we know protection only lasts 60 to 70 weeks of age right now. However, they were still waiting to do research on the subject. In the Netherlands, producers only vaccinate in the rearing phase. And when I asked one why, he said that they're very confident in their biosecurity, so they see it as a minor risk. However, in places like Asia, the situation's a bit different. Boosters are being used, and that's because they have different disease pressures and the use of expensive and open-sided housing. I now want to move on to challenges that affect Canadian producers, and I have them under these two categories. Now, to understand this first challenge, it's important to recognize how essential investing in the pullet is in countries that are successful with this trend. All interviewees stressed that producing high-quality eggs for longer starts with the pullet. So in addition to some of those topics I mentioned, there was also a huge emphasis on meeting the body weight and body composition goals set by the primary breeders. But how do producers stay informed about those facts? Well, I learned that in Latin America and the States, you have large vertically integrated companies where the pullet rearer is also the egg producer, so it's easy to stay informed. In the Netherlands, it's common for producers to visit their flocks 2 to 3 times before receiving them, and they might even have remote access to the pullet barn computer. In Belgium, the story is similar. However, producers might also ask for certain feeds to be fed and pay a premium, or they might just buy the chicks themselves and organize their rearing with someone they trust. As you can see, there's a huge focus on investing in the rearing period. And this isn't to say this doesn't happen in Canada. However, here we have a more inflexible pullet market. Many of our pullet rearers are also egg producers, and there's not a lot of them. It leads to less competition and therefore issues with scheduling flexibility. For example, the Netherlands is a small country with a large number of pullet rearers. Alternatively, Canada is much larger, and therefore it's unrealistic for producers to visit their pullets regularly. Additionally, the lack of pullet rearer also leads to scheduling issues. In the Netherlands or Belgium, you might only have to give 5 months notice for a flock. But I learned that in Western Canada, you'd have to give a minimum of 8 months notice, and in a worst case scenario, it could still take 1 to 2 years to see changes in your flock cycle length. I now want to move on to the processing industry challenges. And when it comes to this, shell and egg quality are important to consider, which is why the number one question asked by Canadians in my project was, can you sell an egg from an 80-week-old hen to a restaurant? And the answer from my interviewees was yes, genetics has made it possible. In fact, researchers in Belgium studied the effect of age on these parameters by sampling eggs from the belts of commercial farms. And they found that yes, age has an effect on these parameters, but at 80 weeks of age, they were still acceptable for consumers. And that indicated the potential for longer flock cycles in that country. However, many countries are still accommodating for the effect of age on egg and shell quality. So in the Netherlands, you have eggs from younger flocks going to supermarkets and food service, from older flocks going to other markets. In Belgium, you have food service eggs coming from caged white hens exclusively because of better shell quality. And in the US, they might use the strategy of blending flocks to assist with the grading process. Another difference is Canada has a limited processing industry and a smaller market for processed eggs. An example of a country that does not have this problem is the Netherlands. They export nearly 60% of their eggs to other places in Europe, and they're also home to multinational food companies such as Unilever and Nestle, and they have a market for liquid and powdered eggs, and a market for boiled and painted eggs year-round. This is a brief overview of those challenges, and as you can see, there's a uniquely Canadian challenge I was unable to talk about more in depth. However, it does contribute to those other Canadian challenges I talked about. Before I finish, I want to share the objectives or the outcomes of my second objective, which were the case studies. I was fortunate to speak to 3 contacts from the Netherlands, the US, and Belgium. 2 of which were producers, whereas the third one was a researcher from the Experimental Poultry Center. Of the 2 producers, the American producer also raised pullets. Both had brown layers, but the Dutch producer also had white layers. And I learned that in Belgium, producers have a wide variety of options, all of which are being used for longer flock cycles. Both producers shared similar housing systems, and both European nations take their birds a little bit longer in flock cycle length, whereas the American producer was taking them to 82 weeks because of shell quality issues. In terms of motivations, the Dutch producer was strongly motivated by sustainability. In his country, there is a huge demand for efficient use of resources. He's also a very animal welfare conscious producer, and he credited his detail-oriented management to being able to keep these birds for so long. He also said that the Dutch usually don't want to be the last to try something, so when he saw it was possible, he said, why not? The American producer was motivated by the economic benefits. The ability to bring down his pullet cost price, in addition to only cleaning the barn every 1.5 years versus every year, was a great factor, and access to more large and extra large eggs. When I asked a researcher in Belgium what motivated producers, she said that Hendrix Genetics had been doing large marketing campaigns in the country about the genetic potential of their birds, and that got producers excited about exploring cost savings. Many of the producers had similar challenges, but I'm going to focus on some of their unique comments. So when I asked the Dutch producer what the biggest initial shock was, He said it was mortality, and this is the nature of keeping birds for longer. But as you learn to navigate the learning curve of longer flock cycles, it becomes better. The American producer talked about gut health. Because of his organic certification, his birds are out and about, eating bugs, dirt, manure, and it became harder to manage with age. However, he would feed citric acid through the water system on a weekly basis to help with this. Floor eggs was mentioned as an issue by both producers and attributed to their housing systems, which is why they had a huge emphasis on training and the use of lights and temperature. Both the American and the Belgian researcher mentioned shell quality. The American producer actually had easy access to breaking facilities, which made it easier to manage as the birds got older, and he introduced me to the strategy of blending flocks. When I asked the researcher in Belgium about this, she said that molting is still an attractive option for producers, depending on pullet prices and egg prices. In the European nations, feather pecking was harder to manage with the ban on beak trimming. However, over time and the use of strategies such as environmental enrichment, feed additives, and management, it would get better and better. The US producer mentioned this as more of an issue of feather coverage, because as the birds get older, there's more wear and tear, and you need to prevent that in order to prevent an increase in feed intake over time. This brings me to the end of my case studies and the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Daniella. Another great presentation. And here we've got a couple of questions on the board. The
Awesome.
First one from Ian Turner. I think you partially answered it, but I'll ask it nonetheless. Did you collect any information regarding what breeds or strain of birds are used elsewhere in the world where laying cycles are significantly longer than Canada? Are they the same breed or different types?
Yeah, so I had the really great opportunity of speaking to people from Hendrix and from Lohman, who were in charge of kind of the American and Latin American branch. The people from Lohman were very insistent that the birds that they're using for longer flock cycles are the same ones that we're using up here in Canada. And that's why they actually had a lot of questions for me as to why we weren't seeing it. Obviously, the answer is we have a little bit of a different infrastructure set up in our system. But they did emphasize they're the exact same birds. Same with Hendrix Genetics. They, in speaking to two people from there, again, they were insistent that it really does come down to the management and how data conscious the producer is. So I would say in terms of management, the common thread that either people describe these producers as, or when I spoke to those two, was they were very, very data conscious about weighing their birds regularly, walking through the barns, just sitting and watching their birds. And that isn't to say that producers here in Canada aren't doing that. I just think that for this trend, what I learned is there's a significant learning curve, and you have to kind of admit that the first 2 years might not go well with this trend, because it is a little bit of a risk in terms of navigating the learning curve.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the same way, here, I think I did not capture that from the presentation, but there is also a big difference in production system. Like in Canada, we have a supply management type of production system,
Yes.
which is directed by the marketing boards. How is that working in Europe and the States?
Yeah, so obviously the quota system in the Netherlands, you pay apparently $40 Canadian to enter. So very, very different. But yeah, obviously with our supply management system and even province to province. So for example, I learned that in BC and Manitoba, it's not regulated. In Alberta, we work best on a 52-week production cycle. In Ontario, they use home week policy, which requires the birds to be out of the barns by 70 weeks of age. So obviously there's even difficulties within provinces in terms of whether or not producers can pursue it. So that plays a huge issue that I felt like I had to explain to interviewees over and over again, because they just didn't understand. But it was interesting to note that some of the, for example, talking to hatcheries and pullet rearers, some producers are being forced to take their birds a little bit longer to 13 and a half, 14 months, because they're being turned away from the hatcheries and rearers because they can't fit them in their cycle, or their rearing cycles appropriately. So some are being forced to go longer, maybe not as long as Europe or Latin America, but we're starting to see a little bit of it.
Well, thank you very much. So we also have two questions from Danielle, but we are now eating on our little break. So maybe I'll pitch the second one and then you can answer the first one online. What is a blended flock?
So this was explained in two ways for me. So by the producer I spoke to, he said that sometimes if a flock is 50 weeks of age and 72 weeks of age, they'll blend the eggs from those flocks. So it dilutes the bad quality eggs, so they don't have to set the graders as sensitive. So if they were to run all those eggs from an older flock through the grading system, they would just shoot all the eggs. In terms of bigger grading facilities, I learned that incoming eggs are screened for blood, dirts, and cracks. And once they get past that, they go into an area with many different packers, up to 20. And then that divides them and it's more efficient for equipment and staff. So that's the kind of the two ways I learned about it.
All right, thank you very much.